Anne Enright is the author of five previous novels, including The Wig My Father Wore, The Gathering, and The Forgotten Waltz. She has also published three collections of short stories and the nonfiction book Making Babies, Stumbling into Motherhood. She's won too many awards to name, so I'll mention just a few. The 1991 Rooney Prize for Irish Literature for The Portable Virgin, the 2007 Man Booker Prize, and the 2008 Irish Novel of the Year for The Gathering, and the 2012 Carnegie Medal for Excellence for The Forgotten Waltz. In her new novel, The Green Road, we meet the Madigan family, Dan, Constance, Emmett, Hannah, and the matriarch, the irrepressible mother, Rosaline. Since leaving the family home in Boulevan, I don't know how to pronounce that, in the west of Ireland, all the siblings have led interesting lives with varying degrees of success and happiness. But when their mother calls them home to celebrate Christmas one more time in their childhood home before she sells the house, the first time in many years that the adult children have all been together at the same time, the love and conflict that mark their relationship emerges. With fierce intelligence, wit, and crackling dialogue, The Green Road captures the joys and sorrows of family, and it's truly an honor to introduce Anne Enright.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask Anne some questions, but also she's going to read from her book. Maybe you want to start by reading a part?
I could, yeah. I could read from the beginning of the book, which doesn't need too much explanation. The first half of the book has four distinct sections, about a decade apart, with each of the four children and where they go and what they do and what life throws their way and whether they catch it or duck in each case before they come back home for the second half. So, and we start with Hannah. Hannah is 12. This is Ireland in 1980, which is in the west coast of Ireland. It's very like Ireland in 1960. It's very like Ireland in 1950. It's a country that doesn't know yet that it has already changed. So Dan, the eldest boy, has been talking about becoming a priest. He's in his first year at college. So this is the scene where he discusses this with the rest of them. It's Palm Sunday, which is every good Catholic knows is the Sunday before Easter, and he's home from college. The parents sat on at either end of the table, the children along the sides, girls facing the window, boys facing the room, Constance and Hannah, Emmett and Dan. There was a fire in the grate, and the sun also shone now and then, so they were as warm as winter and as warm as summer for 5 minutes at a time. They were twice as warm. Dan said, "I have been speaking again with Father Fall." It was April, a dappled kind of day. The clean light caught the drops on the window pane in all their multiplicity, while outside 1,000 baby leaves unfurled against branches black with rain. Inside, their mother had a tissue trapped in the palm of her hand. She lifted it against her forehead. "Oh no," she said, turning away, and her mouth sagged open so you could see the carrots. "He says I must ask you to think again, that it is hard for a man who does not have his family behind him. It is a big decision I am making. And he says, I must ask you, I must plead with you not to spoil it with your own feelings and concerns." Dan spoke as though they were in private, or he spoke as though they were in a great hall, but it was a family meal, which was neither of these things. You could see their mother had an impulse to rise from the table, but would not allow herself to flee. "He says I am to ask your forgiveness for the life you had hoped for me and the grandchildren you will not have." Emmett snorted into his dinner. Dan pressed his hands down on the table before swiping at his little brother fast and hard. Their mother blanked for the blow like a horse jumping a ditch. But Emmett ducked, and after a long second, she landed on the other side. She put her head down as though to gather speed. A moan came out of her, small and unformed. The sound of it seemed to please as well as surprise her. So she tried again. This next moan. So she tried again. This next moan started soft and went long, and there was a kind of speaking to its last rise and fall. "Oh, God," she said. She threw her head back and blinked at the ceiling once, twice. "Oh, dear God." The tears started to run, one on top of the last, down to her hairline. 1, 2, 3, 4. She stayed like that for a moment while the children watched and pretended not to be watching, and her husband cleared his throat into the silence. Their mother lifted her hands and shook them free of her sleeves. She wiped her wet temples with the heel of her hands and used her delicate, crooked fingers to fix the back of her hair, which she always wore in a chignon. Then she sat up again and looked very carefully at nothing. She picked up a fork and stuck it into a piece of bacon, and she brought it to her mouth, but the touch of meat to her tongue undid her. The fork swung back down towards her plate and the bacon fell. Her lips made that wailing shape, touching at the middle and open at the sides, what Dan called her wide mouth frog look. Then she took a sharp inhale and went, "Ah, ah." It seemed to Hannah her mother might stop eating, or if she was that hungry, she might take her plate and go into another room to cry. But this did not occur to her mother clearly, and she sat there eating and crying at the same time. Much crying, little eating. There was more work with the tissue, which was now in shreds. It was awful. The pain was awful. Her mother juddering and sputtering, with the carrots falling from her mouth in little lumps and piles. Constance, who was the eldest, bossed them all quietly about, and they carried plates and cups past their mother as she dripped one way or the other into her own food. "Oh, Mammy," said Constance, leaning in with her arm about her to slip the plate neatly away. Dan was the eldest boy, so it was his job to cut the apple tart, which he stood to do, dark against the window light, with the silver triangle of the cake slice in his hand. "You can count me out," said their father, who had been playing in a tiny way with the handle of his teacup. He got up and left the room, and Dan said, "5 so. How am I going to do 5? There were 6 Madigans. 5 was a whole new angle as he moved the cake slice through the ghost of a cross and then swung it 18 degrees to the side. It was a prizing open of the relations between them. It was a different story altogether, as though there might be any number of Madigans. And out in the wide world, any number of apple tarts.
Thank you. I remember from hearing you read before what a great performer of your work you are, and
It's hard in a tent.
well, it led me to the obvious question. Could you talk a little bit about your connection to the theater and your background and how it plays a part in your life?
Yeah, I started out, and when I went to Trinity College Dublin, I spent most of my time in the student theatre there, messing around and doing the lights and doing the sound and being on stage. And then after I left college, I worked as an actress for a year. I mean, work is a big word for an actress. I was unemployed as an actress for half a year, and then maybe I was employed for a quarter of a year. And yes, so I have a lot of friends in the theatre in Dublin, and I think some of that role playing and that kind of freedom to improvise. I mean, improvising is something that helps at the desk. You kind of enter the character and you are them for a while. So it helps the voice.
Well, the voice is definitely there. The Green Road has a very straightforward structure. We meet, if you haven't read it yet, you have a great experience to look forward to. But we meet all of the children. We meet all of the 4 siblings, and then we meet the mother, each in their own chapter, and each in a very important part in their life. And then the whole second part of the book is all of them getting together for this big celebration. I don't know about a celebration, but getting together to reune. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the structure and why that appealed to you as when you sat down to write the book.
Well, I didn't get the structure until about a year after I started to write the book. So I sat down to. Sometimes it works when you're writing two books and you don't know that it's all the same book. I was writing. I started off writing the wrong book. I didn't really want to write this book. It was about Emmett in Africa. Emmett. Dan does not become a priest, but Emmett in a way does become a priest. He not a priest. He goes on the missions, as it were. He becomes a worker in the developing world, an emergency aid and then development work, and goes everywhere. So I was writing about Africa, and I was sitting in West Clare in this lovely little house overlooking the Aran Islands and Galway Bay, very, very beautiful and iconic part of Ireland. And I was going up the Green Road every day for my walk, which is a real road that looks out over this view. And it was a good long while before I realised that Green Road would have to also be in the book. The book I wanted to write was not a book about a development worker in Africa, although that's a really interesting area. I was interested when I was writing Emmett about the whole business of compassion, the problem of goodness. That's what my problem was, writing that bit. But anyway, what I wanted to write was King Lear. I wanted to, the way, in my modest way, I wanted to rewrite King Lear, and I wanted to make Lear a female. And I don't know how familiar people are with the play, but Lear divides his kingdom. He demands affection from his children. They lie to him. Two of them lie. One of them tells the truth. He's impatient, petulant. His brain might be going. He rails against the ingratitude of his children. And you just put that into a female voice, such selfish children I reared is Rosalind's kind of thing. That's one of the things she'd say. Or she'd say, I don't know why none of you has any money. I suppose that's my fault too. I don't know what I did to deserve that, she says. So Rosalind makes a very, she had the fragility of Lear. She makes a very fragile kind of King Lear. And I was interested in that fragility. When she was young, I just put a few little vanities into this character, and I saw how they might age, that they just get harder and harder to keep up, really. Rosalind thinks she comes from people. Her father is the local pharmacist, which is a very big thing in an Irish town. So she's of the impression that she's quite important. And her children leave her, and she's always worried her children are going to leave her. In fact, that's a very good worry to have as a mother, because your children are leaving you. There's no inaccuracy in that. They do nothing but leave you from the day they're born. And so she's always on the brink of feeling abandoned.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Obviously, I didn't know it would be the Lear reference. It makes perfect sense, obviously. But
well, that's behind the book. Then when you're writing the book, it's just the characters tend to make their own demands, and you abandon your original plans or modify them in some way. So.
Because she's pretty crazy from the beginning. She doesn't go crazy.
Yeah, it depends on who you talk to. I mean, it depends on who you talk to, whether she's crazy or not. Because, Hannah looking at her there crying at the table, and she's really stepping back from this figure of her mother crying. Dan gets on very well with his mother, and they have a very chatty, full of chat, a very good relation. Well, but Dan never comes home. Dan's the golden boy. Anyway, they each have a different perspective on her, and I let that be. At one stage, she's wonderful when she's young. She's very charming. She's beautiful. She's interested in art, in poetry, in the view. But that being wonderful can't really sustain old age,
But even when they were young, Hannah describes her as horizontal.
Yeah, she takes the horizontal solution. She goes to bed a lot. Sure. I wouldn't blame her for that. I'm a great believer in the horizontal solution myself, actually. So,
My question was she as a character for you, at least to your mind, was she fairly typical for her time and place? And how do you think her condition, her eccentricities, played a part in shaping the characters of the children?
well, I have been accused of writing a quintessential Irish mother, but I write many different mothers. In my different books, there are various mothers in them, and I like putting a mother in there, partly because in heterosexual male fiction, there are very few mothers. I mean, psychoanalysis is all about the mother. The novel is about everything else, everything but the mother. So I like to put the mother back in there to see how that works out. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm personally of the opinion that after the age of 45, you should stop blaming your parents and sort yourself out, really. So, so I mean, Rosaline isn't to blame for her children, but each of them has a kind of their stuff catches up with them, one way or the other, as your stuff does. They have to learn how to live, how to become proper human beings, which I think is one of the things most of us are interested in, how to become a proper human being. And Rosaline is a slight barrier to that for them. She is a challenge to their compassion, finally. You leave. When I talk about separating from the mother, you separate from the mother, which is this universal thing, and you walk back in 40 years later, and you just meet your mother, who is the human being who gave birth to you. So it's a shift from that oceanic kind of psychological everythingness of the mother down to this very particular individual human being with all her flaws and her delights.
I think all of the kids' stories could have been novels in their own right. They're interesting enough, and we're just treated to to a moment of their lives, or to a part of their lives. And Emmett, of course, Emmett is central to the book, but he says at one point, he thinks this. I don't think he says it. He says because wars you can do, and famines you can do, and floods are relatively easy. But no one survives when the cook scratches his arse and then decides not to bother washing his hands. And that struck me as funny, but also really tragic and meaningful. And it also, to me, it seemed to relate to a little microcosmically to the story of the kids' lives. And they were able to handle their own lives and be very productive adults. But when it came down to just being able to be in the same room with each other, oftentimes they were in conflict.
I have to say one thing, that please wash your hands is one of the most important signs that you could put up in Africa, because people die from hygiene issues, so not washing your hands is very serious in Africa. So that's just true. You can dodge the bullets, but you can be prostrated with amoebic dysentery for weeks in the heat and in the middle of nowhere. So it is important that the cook washes his hands or her hands. But yeah, there's a lot about physical frailty in the book. There's a lot about the book is very rooted in people's bodies and how they go wrong and go right a little. Or mortality, or our ideas about mortality. But yeah, I'm glad you say that each of those sections could be a novel in itself, because they are sort of different novels. And it was a way of doing this thing, which is the individualistic modern novel. And then I wanted to bring it back to something a bit more like the 19th century novel, where people meet and talk and connect and are not separate, and so we know more. When they come back, we know a really large amount about these children of Rosaline Madigan. And we know more about their lives than they know about each other's lives. And it's something about when you come home and you're grown up and you've seen things, you have been elsewhere. Your life is full of the unexpected somehow, even if you don't move very far. But your family aren't interested in all that. They're interested in the usual stuff, the old stuff. So you're both extraordinarily, you find your siblings, in the Madigans anyway, you're really familiar with your siblings. You know their irritating habits. You know the sound of their footfall, but you don't really know them the way their lovers know them, their colleagues know them, or the way they now know themselves. So trying to fit back into that childhood space, I think, is interesting. They bounce off each other. I don't want to sound paranoid, but I am often accused of writing dysfunctional families. And I just don't know what a functional family is. They all come back for Christmas. There's a problem, which I don't even highlight in the text, that nobody except Constance washes any dishes. But that's not exactly heroin, you know. It's, they bumble along and they snag off each other and are lonely and connected in different ways.
Well, they struck me as a real family, and the humor that comes out in the book is the kind of humor that comes across when brothers and sisters get together, and they're naturally funny people. I was also struck. I was lucky enough to have visited Ireland. My mother's family's from Westport, and so I knew this part of the world. I had just been there, and I knew the Burren and the Cliffs of Moher, and but you're not from the west of Ireland. Can you talk about why you set the book there and the significance of place? And Boulavon is not a real place, right? That's a fictional place.
Well, actually, it's a townland. I moved it about 5 miles north. But I mean, the name exists, but yeah, those names are translated from the Irish. So I sort of made it up and found it at the same time. No, I mean, in terms of the Irish tradition, I'm a middle-class chick from Dublin, which is the next door to being a Protestant, really. I mean, I'm almost like an English person as far as the Irish tradition is concerned. My father comes from the west coast of Ireland, and we spent a lot of our time down on the farm, the small farm in just 30 miles south of there on Loop Head in County Clare. So the fact that I found this landscape so difficult to approach, I'm like in my 50s, and I kind of think, well, yeah, maybe that's as much mine as